Hello, folks. This is Susan Morton and Renee Webb from the Linn County Master Gardeners, and we are here to have a webinar on how to clean and maintain your mason bee cocoons. Many of you are keeping mason bees now or are interested in doing so, and it is important to maintain them to prevent diseases and pests from going into the next generation. So we've prepared this webinar, since we can't hold workshops, to help you help your bees. Renee Webb is going to do the first part of the presentation. So I'm giving it over to Renee, and I might make some color commentary.
We work together very well, Susan. I want to start out by telling you that we have been involved since about 6 years working on this because we want to promote this native bee. We also have a bee event pollinator conference in the spring. It's in March every year, so you can kind of watch for that. This next year will be a little bit different because we will probably be doing something similar to this. It will be more of an internet-based presentation, but we've covered all different types of pollinators, not just the blue orchard mason bee. On this screen, you see the female blue orchard bee. This bee is about the same size as a honeybee. It's a little bit smaller, just barely. It is black looking and in the sun has an iridescence to it. The female is the person who takes care of all of the laying of the eggs and things like that and keeps this going. She is a solitary bee. The male bee is out there as well. The male bee only lives for about 2 weeks. His main purpose is to make sure that she is able to fertilize her eggs. So they have to mate, and then after he does his mating with her, he dies. So he has about a 2-week life cycle. She has about a 6-week life cycle, maybe 8 weeks max. And she is laying her eggs during that time, and she's tending her own nest all by herself. She's like a farmer. She comes out very early in the day and she works very late at night. So she is there to pollinate lots and lots and lots of flowers. She also will come out when it's 50 or 55 degrees. A honeybee won't come out until it's about 60 degrees. So she comes out much earlier than other bees. She also comes out earlier in the spring because of the weather differences where she can come out early. She rarely stings. I think I may have said that. She also will work in light rain, and that is something that makes her a true Oregonian for this particular type of bee. The male bee is smaller. It has white whiskers. I kind of like to call it an old man before its time because it starts out with white whiskers. So that's kind of a way to differentiate them when you're watching them in this, later on. You can see the one with the white whiskers is the male. And why do we harvest these cocoons? Well, in nature, only about 30% of the mason bees survive. But with our help, about 90% will survive. That's because we're doing the cleaning and looking for pests and so forth, and then putting them in ideal temperatures for the winter. In nature, the eggs are laid in crevices and cracks and hollow stems. Maybe it'll be in your wood pile. They won't cause damage to your masonry or anything like that because they're using existing holes. So we like to provide holes for them and houses for them so that we can collect these cocoons and be able to help them, more of them survive. If you don't service your mason bees and properly store them, within a very short period of time, a year or two, you can lose most of your mason bees. So we are making sure that you know the proper techniques to be able to have more of those cocoons to survive. Let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of a blue orchard mason bee. By the way, they are from Oregon, or this particular species is from Oregon. The presentation we're doing today is primarily for the Willamette Valley in Oregon. So if you are watching this from another location, you might need to look at a little bit different timing for some of these, but there are mason bees in almost every state and almost every community. the life cycle starts with the mating. In March and April, the female and the male mate. Then the female starts building her nest in the tubes that we provide, or the holes we provide. She builds a mud wall. She collects a lot of mud to do that wall. Then she goes out and collects a bunch of pollen, a little bit of nectar, and makes a pollen ball. She lays her egg on that pollen ball, and then she walls off that cell with another amount of mud. About 10 days later, the mason bee egg changes into a pupa, and then it changes into a larva. The larva is eating that pollen ball and the pupa and so forth up until the time that the larva spins a cocoon. The larva will be putting out some poop during that process. So you'll see some of that around the larva, around the, as later when you're harvesting. The larva then is in that stage with the cocoon having been spun, and that cocoon will be there from June until October. Inside that cocoon are fully developed bees by this time of year. So in October and November, we harvest these cocoons and put them in ideal situations. And when that comes around to March and April of next year, we'll be putting out those cocoons so that they can be out there to start the whole process again. Mason bees are super pollinators. They are very effective at pollinating fruits and trees and berries. Of course, they pollinate flowers too while they're out there. About 7 mason bees will pollinate as many flowers as 500 honeybees. So we're really trying to promote these as an addition to the honeybees that are out there. Obviously, the honeybees are very effective at pollinating, but the mason bees add a good value. There have been studies done that show that about 25% more apples are produced in an apple orchard when you add mason bees to that orchard. Let's talk a little bit about some of the differences. There's lots of differences, but the honeybee will need about 5 contacts with the flower to fully pollinate the flower. And the reason for that is that most of the pollen goes into a special pocket. The honeybee will go into the flower and kind of walk around the stamen and get pollen on her body, and then she'll scrape it into that pocket. So she won't leave a whole lot of pollen on her body. And so that's why it takes more contacts to completely pollinate a flower. If you've ever seen an apple where one side of it is kind of scrunched in, that's because it wasn't fully pollinated. Now, the mason bee, on the other hand, is kind of messy, kind of like a kindergartner or a little kid. And it's out there having fun in that flower. It's going all over the place, and it is getting pollen all over its hairy body. It doesn't have that special pocket. So the pollen just stays on its body when it goes to the next flower. And about 95% of the time, it will fully pollinate the flower with just one contact. We do want to give mason bees a good home. So we do houses. You can do the wooden house on the left or the wooden house on the right or something similar to that, another wooden box. You can also use a can. You can use PVC pipe. The main thing is that you want to have the depth about 8 inches. And the reason for that is that you want to help protect the blocks and the tubes from having so much rain on them, which would encourage more mold. So the ideal length for the hole that we provide is 6 inches. So the blocks and the tubes that you see around should be 6 inches. That's a depth that we want. And then we have the 5/16 inch holes too as well. So you can use a variety of things. Obviously, we use the houses that we sell, but there are places around that you can buy houses as well. One of the problems is a lot of the houses that you see out there are bad houses for the bob, for the blue orchard bee, by the way. Bob is a shortening name for the blue orchard bee. The first one I'm showing here is the drilled holes. You'll see this on the internet fairly often still. It's an old technology. Basically, back in the past, it was like the beta of doing a VHS type thing versus what we're using now to do things. So the problem with the drilled holes is you cannot open and clean those holes. So you get pest buildup, and after a few years, possibly as little as 1 year, those become dead sites. So we don't want to use drilled holes. The next one is really cute. I like this one. It has a lot of different sizes of holes for a variety of different types of bees. You can see that some of those can't be opened on the top either. But the ones on the bottom are the ones that appear to be for mason bees. They have a nice little screen on the front to help keep birds out. Problem is the depth on that one, and I looked it up on the internet, is only 4 inches deep. We need to have the optimal 6 inches deep. If the mason bee lays eggs in this, you're going to get mostly males, probably very, very few females. And the reason for that is that the mason bee puts most of her or all of her eggs at the back and fertilizes them to make them female. And then at the front, she puts the male cocoons. The male cocoons are a little bit more expendable if a bird does come to try to eat some of the cocoons. But in this particular house, you would probably only get males. And obviously we can't keep the population going that way. The next one.
Mason Bee Monastery.
Yes. So the bamboo one that we see next has bamboo tubes in it. We see this particular design that has been sold a lot of places fairly often in our cocoon harvesting classes. The problem is those bamboo tubes that are in there. Bamboo cannot be opened. So it's kind of like the drilled holes. You're going to have a cemetery after a short period of time because you can't get in to clean the cocoons. You can possibly pull them out and try to put them in a cold situation or something like that. It also has a very short overhang, so moisture can get in much more easily. It's also designed to hang, so it can swing. That can displace the eggs if it bumps into the whatever it's hanging from and knocks off the egg before it's had a chance to develop. So that's a potential problem as well. Every year, in any of the cocoon harvesting classes that we've taught, I've been asked, how about plastic straws? Well, we've also seen plastic blocks too. And in all of those cases, the plastic causes mold. The moisture can't escape, so they're not breathable. So we really do not encourage you to use plastic straws, especially here in the Willamette Valley where it rains quite a bit. We can provide holes though for them. They're artificial holes. We have a block that we use, and you find those in some of the stores as well. You want to be sure that you look for a block that is 6 inches long, because that's the ideal length to get the male-female population right. They do last for a long time. They can last 20, 30 years if you make sure that you clean them properly and then clamp them back together so that they don't warp. If you don't do those processes, they won't last quite as long and won't be as useful because the holes will get too big for the bees. The advantage for us is that we can take these apart, and it's much, much faster for harvesting. So we're doing these blocks mostly for our benefit, not so much for the bee benefit. The one thing that we do find though is that pests can build up a little more quickly in these. So don't buy a block that has 100 holes or 150 holes, or don't make one that's that much. It's going to be kind of like a condominium or a dormitory. If a disease gets in there, it's going to spread a lot more quickly. So you want to be sure that you don't have too many holes in one location. And that's probably true when you're putting up houses too. You probably want to spread them out just a little bit around your yard or around your property so that they're not right next to each other. I've seen some really cute houses where people have made, and then they put in a whole bunch of blocks right together. And that kind of defeats the purpose of keeping the holes apart. We do want to be sure to tell you though that you need to put a cover on the back side of these on the side that the bees are not going into, obviously. You can put cardboard there. You can put a piece of wooden block and just tape it on the back. You have to tape it on because otherwise you wouldn't be able to take these blocks apart. But they do want to go into a dark hole to lay their eggs. Another thing we can provide are tubes and liners, and we can use those as holes for the mason bees. The advantage is that the bees actually usually like the liners and tubes more than they like the block. They will go to the area where they can find a hole. So obviously, eventually they'll use both. I have heard people say it only went to my blocks this year, and another person says it only went to my cardboard tubes. I've had experience, depending on the year, of that sometimes I get more eggs in the block and sometimes I get more eggs in the tubes and liners. But as far as the studies have been done, the tubes with the liners are probably more popular than the blocks, although they both get used. The disadvantage is that the cardboard tubes, the one that you see, the brown paper cardboard tubes, last about 3 to 4 years. They get wet or a pest build up in them, the pest can stay in them. So you'll have to replace those after 3 or 4 years. The liners are in the middle are put into those paper cardboard tubes, and those are replaced every year if they're used. And what I mean by if they're used is if they have done any building in there. What the bee does is she goes in and she scents it. She uses pheromones to scent that area, and it says, "This is my hole." So if you see any evidence of even just a little bit of a mud wall in the back, it means that tube liner has been used. So you'll have to discard that and put in fresh liners every year. It does take longer to open than the block. It probably take 3 or 4 times longer to open the liners than it does harvesting from a block. We do pre-split our liners for faster harvesting. I will show you this a little bit better later, but I can show you a little bit now. If you get a letter cutter and just go down the side of the tube, you can split it. That speeds up the harvesting process quite a bit. And we do that with all of the liners that Linn County Master Gardener sells. So anyhow, just a tip for you, if you buy them at a nursery or something, get a paper envelope cutter and go ahead and split those liners and make it a lot faster. Another option are stems, hollow stems. Teasel is one that we see around here a lot along the roadways. You can cut, they have natural segments, so you can cut them at the segments. You're going to be trying to cut them so that they're at least 6 inches long, so you get that male-female mix. They're easy to open. We're going to have some demonstrations later, and I'll demonstrate how to open that. And then it also provides a variety of holes. Some of those holes will be used by other bees, but you'll be able to tell which ones were used by the mason bee because they'll have that mud wall at the end. The disadvantage, of course, is that it takes time to harvest them and cut them, but they are free. Another option for hollow stems are reeds, pond reeds. You can find those on the internet. They're kind of expensive, but they are very easy to split too, unlike the bamboo. So both teasel and the pond reeds are easy to split and to harvest from. We do want to give you a tip that if you leave stems in your garden during your fall cleanup, cut your flowers off, especially the ones that have hollow stems, at about 6, 8 inches, probably 8 inches tall, and leave them for the winter. That will provide some extra stuff, as well as leaving some of your leaves in your beds for beneficial insects. Now, the placement of the bee house is fairly important. You want to be sure that it's at least 3 feet high. That way it's not in a splash zone, so that when it rains, it doesn't get water on it and cause more mold issues. We say 3 to 6 feet, and that's so that you can enjoy watching them. You can put them higher than that. That's not a problem. The bees are going to find the holes. They don't care what height it is. We're saying 3 to 6 feet so we can enjoy watching them and seeing them going in and putting in their mud and coming back out and so forth. You also want to put them on a south or southeast wall for morning sun. You don't want to have them in the direct sun in the afternoon. It gets too hot and they just won't even use the holes because it's too hot for their cocoons or for their eggs. You want to be sure to have the opening away from the prevailing wind and rain. So that's why we say southeast direction. You don't want to put it under a porch, or at least not very far under a porch. No, a short distance is fine, but you don't want to put it in the middle of a porch because bees do use ultraviolet light to navigate. And so they need to be able to find that hole. You don't want to put it near water you do want to put it near water or a mud source, but not over a pond. Water, of course, is important, and we'll talk about the mud source in just a second here. You do want to put it away from a bird feeder. This year, I got quite a few things through our BeeNotes, and I'll talk about that later too, where people were telling me that they had woodpeckers get into their blocks and they ate a lot of the cocoons. They were very tasty little morsels for them. And the other thing that happened was that somebody had reported that the scrub jays had come in and pulled out the tubes and of course caused some damage that way. So you do want to put it away from the bird feeder a little bit and kind of watch to be sure that the birds don't disturb that area. There is a tip that you can do, which we haven't talked about very much in the past. You can put a screen on the front of your house. You want to be sure that the holes are at least an inch, so like a chicken wire would be fine or something like that. And preferably put it out about 4 to 6 inches from the house so that the birds can't get access if you do have it near a bird feeder or if you're not checking it regularly. So what do mason bees need? They need mud. They need a clayey mud, not a sandy mud. They also need water. A way to provide mud, if you put down a lot of mulch or if you put down some of the weed cloth type of things, which we don't recommend weed cloth. But if you do have that in your yard and you don't have very much exposed soil, you can dig a hole, probably 8 inches or a foot wide and about 6 to 10 inches deep. And then you can just sprinkle some water in that regularly. Or if you have a drip irrigation system, you could even put an emitter there so that there is water in that hole pretty much all the time, a little bit of water. And then the bee will decide along that wall where she wants that mud, what the consistency is. She does like a clay mud that is kind of slick and so forth. So when you rub it between the things, it's the type of mud that you think of as being clay. Like every being, it needs water. So you do need to have a water source, have water around. Sprinklers obviously provide water if you have lawn sprinklers and things like that, but you can also use your bird bath and put a rock in and things like that, and that will help her, or a little container and put a rock in and have water in it. Probably one of the most important things mason bees need is flowers. They need flowers that are blooming as early as mid-February and through June, because that's their lifespan. We do encourage you to plant flowers to take care of the whole season so that you can help other bees as well. Some of the flowers that are important, of course, are fruit trees. But if you have fruit trees, they're probably going to bloom for 2-3 weeks, and then those flowers are going to be gone. So what else are they going to have? So we recommend doing a lot of natives. OSU has a great, several actually articles on good flowers for winter blooming. You do want to try to use natives as much as possible. The bees do prefer the natives over some of the hybrids. And in fact, some of the hybrids even have some of the pollen and nectar bred out of them. I think about, my mother used to get lilies, and I remember we would go near them and we would get pollen all over us, and it would stain our clothes or our hands and things like that. Well, the modern lilies don't have much pollen at all because that has been bred out of them. So there are other hybrids like that. So you're going to try to look for some of the more native and some of the flowers that do provide pollen. Mahonia, Oregon grape, is a great flower for the mason bee. Big leaf maple provides a lot of pollen. Willows provide pollen. Crocuses provide pollen. There are a lot of flowers that provide pollen. Bees do like white, yellow, blue, purple, and ultraviolet colored flowers. So that's their preference for flowers. So what issues can cocoons have? Susan's going to cover this part of it. So I'm going to turn this over to Susan.
Thank you, Renee. I get to talk about the bad guys, the pests and diseases that we're trying to protect our mason bees from. The most common one is pollen mite. It does not actually attack the bees. It hitchhikes on them. And if there's only 2 or 3 of them, fine. Their mites are tiny. They don't bother the bee. They too eat pollen, so they're just hitching a ride to the next flower. Unfortunately, it's like the hitchhiker who's holding his thumb out, and the motorist stops to help the hitchhiker, and the lone hitchhiker signals his buddies in the bush, and an entire fraternity jumps on the bee. And the weight of the mites can be such that the bee can't fly. And they can also infect the nest sites, and they can eat the pollen ball that the mother bee has laid down for her baby. And of course, the baby bee doesn't survive. It starves because the pollen mites in the nest have eaten its baby food. So you have to control those. You never get completely rid of them, but you can control them. Another one is chalk brood, and it's a fungus. Traditionally, it wasn't a problem for solitary nesting bees, but we have found it in the nest boxes we make, because again, we have collected them in one place. It's like high density living as opposed to country living. I mean, the pandemic is worse than the cities. Okay. And this is true of chalk brood. It attacks the larva of the bee before it pupates, and it invades the larva and turns it into a mummy, which is full of invisibly tiny spores, millions of them. And it can infect a nest site and wipe it out in 1 year if you don't control it. And we do that by washing and with bleach. The other thing that they are subject to is a parasitic wasp, and it's the puncturer. They're tiny little wasps, gnat size, and they can burrow into cardboard tubes or work their way into nest tubes, and they puncture the cocoon before the bee is mature, while it is going through metamorphosis. And the female wasp lays about 15 eggs in each of the cocoons. And these hatch out. And of course, 15 by 15 by 15, they can increase exponentially and also wipe your nest site out. Those are the 3 main problems that we have to address. Some other things you might see as you're cleaning cocoons are domestic beetles. Now, they are the cleaners of the world. They eat dead stuff. So they will not attack a living cocoon or wasp or larva. They will only go into the nest to get something that has already died. And it's nice to get rid of that, but they can do damage to the living ones while they're burrowing in there. If you're cleaning your cocoons this time of year, domestic beetle larvae is about the only live stuff you're likely to find in there, unless maybe a spider's wandered in. But they maybe see crawling larvae, and we will have pictures of those later. What to look for. It's mostly the larvae you're looking for. Other thing you might see is a cuckoo bee. They go in there while Mama Bee, when she's just finishing her 800 flower strikes to make one pollen ball, and she's just about ready to lay her egg. Well, the cuckoo bee will go in there, probably while Mama is fetching mud for the new end cap, and she will thump the mason bee's egg off the pollen ball, maybe even eat it, kill it, and then she will lay her egg on that pollen ball. So it's not as big a problem as the wasp because, it's 1 for 1 rather than 1 for 15, but it is still a problem. Now, the cuckoo bee can be a little of a facer for some. This is where you have to decide whether you are promoting pollinators or promoting bees, because cuckoo bees are bees. So they're not very good pollinators. They're parasitizing the nest of one who is, but they are bees. So anyway, you have to make a decision about that. And other things that happen, birds can bite the ants. Most of the birds that do that, northern flickers, their beaks are not long enough to get down to the females or even to all the males. So, you maybe only hatch out 1 or 2 males. So that is one male who is not going to have any trouble finding a date for the prom. Also, if you've had a leak or a hard rain event, you might find some mold in there. That can destroy a tube pretty quickly. But anyway, next slide. All right, that top picture is what the mites look like when they have gone into a nest tube. Mother dropped them in there. They dropped off of her, and they ate the pollen balls. So that one cell is full of pollen mites. It doesn't have a baby bee in it. The baby bee died. Now, if you can think that these bees come out sequentially, the ones that are behind that ball of mites, when they chew their way out to get out to hatch, they're going to get infected with all those mites. And then you see the bee down on the right-hand side. She's not dead, but she can't fly. She will never be able to raise her bees because she can't get off the ground.
Okay, and I would say almost everybody will see this when they're harvesting. This is definitely the most common issue.
Yes. Okay, this is the chalk brood. If you are harvesting, and when you are harvesting, we urge you to do 1 tube or 1 channel in your block at a time and look for this, because that is one of the most aggressive pests that they have. If you see something that looks like a mummified larva, now remember, by this time of year, all of the larvae should have pupated. If you see one that didn't, you have to assume it's chalk brood and do the proper hygiene. And generally that means all of the cocoons in that channel or that tube need to be destroyed, because you do not want to spread this. You can kill your nest site in a New York minute. And you'd have to do a cleanup when this happens. You have to clean your tools, clean your tray, wipe things down with Santa wipes and bleach spray. And the presence of this is why we recommend a bleach wash rather than a sand wash. If you look on some of the older websites, they talk about putting your cocoons after you've removed them from the tubes into a jar of sand and shaking it up. And that's to get rid of the pollen mites. And it does a beautiful job of that, but it spreads this stuff. So we don't recommend the sand wash. This is the puncturer, the parasitic wasp. Remember, that little wasp is very tiny. It, if you see those dots down there by the bullet points, it's about that size. And it has a very long ovipositor. And if you look on the right there, you will see the holes that ovipositor made, and that is in a wooden block. So Mama Wasp managed to worm her way down in there. And she has killed all of those mason bee cocoons, and each one of those hatched out about another 15 wasps, which went on to destroy some more of the nest. So actually, this mono wasp is pretty easy to prevent. You can't cure it, but you can prevent it. And that is to take your blocks and tubes in on the 1st of June, and you seal them up in a paper bag, like a grocery bag, fold the top over a few times, and either clip it or staple it. The paper will allow the cocoons inside there to get oxygen, but it's too big for the wasp to puncture through. It can't get in there. And this pretty much takes care of this. The wasps do not come out until after the 1st of June. So by doing it then, you have completely prevented this problem. I love prevention. Okay, these are the domestic beetles. Like I say, they're just eating stuff that's already dead. The first instars are usually light colored, and then with each instar, they get a little darker, and they're kind of hairy looking, and they got lots of legs, and you wouldn't want to pick them up and pet them. But they are good at cleaning up dead stuff. I think physical anthropologists use them for mounting human skeletons, so I don't want to think about that. But anyway, that's the only live thing you're liable to see crawling around in there. You don't need to do any hygiene for these. Any damage they do, they've already done when you find them, but most likely they haven't done any.
They actually move fairly quickly too, surprisingly, for a little tiny bug.
Yeah, well, they do have lots of legs.
This is just a closer view.
And the later stages are darker color. And then they eventually, when they mature, morph into a little beetle. Yeah. Okay. All right, this is holes. The larger hole there on the right is one that the domestic beetle has drilled, and these are cardboard tubes, and it has drilled a hole in there because it sensed that there was a dead larva in there, and so it went in there to eat it. These smaller ones are the parasitic wasps, and they have gone in there, and that even though there's only one hole in each of those tubes, it's entirely possible that every cocoon in that tube has been destroyed and replaced.
Often I've seen where they've had holes. There's like 5 or 6 holes along the tube. So that tube was left out way past June 1st, and So you have lots of holes from the parasitic wasp.
But just because there's only one hole doesn't mean the whole tube isn't dead either.
No.
Yeah. Okay. This is the cuckoo bee. She looks a whole lot like a blue orchard mason bee. And of course, that's camouflage. She doesn't want to be picked out as not belonging there. And she lays her eggs in the bob cells that have been supplied but not yet capped. And she'll sneak in there and take their egg off and put her own there. And they develop faster. So even if the mason bee egg has not been killed, the cuckoo bee will eat up all the provisions before the mason bee can develop. So one of these in a cell is pretty much death for the mason bee that was laid in there. It isn't a physical parasite, it's a nest parasite. It co-ops the bee's nest. And it's called cuckoo after the cuckoo bird. And that's exactly what they do. They sneak into another bird's nest and either kick their eggs out or they lay their own egg in there, and their egg hatches out much quicker, and it's usually much bigger, and it gets all the food the parents bring. And that's if the parents don't realize what's happened, and if often they do, and they will abandon the nest.
If you find summer wasps and bees, the reason is because you left your block out after June 1st. So taking the block in before June 1st, and getting all of those tubes that have the mud walls on them put into your bag will prevent having summer bees and summer wasps using your holes. If you do leave them out, though, I wanted to show you some of the things that you can see. For example, you can see that on the grass-carrying wasp, they bring in a lot of grass to put around the cocoons that they lay. And usually there's a little bit of grass sticking out on the end of the tube or the block. It doesn't show very well in this particular picture, but I did want to point out that if you see some grass hanging out, that is a grass-carrying wasp that has used that hole. Leafcutter bees will also use a hole. Yes, Susan? Okay. And
I was going to say that the grass-carrying wasp is a good guy. It eats grasshoppers.
I forgot that. So, yes, it is a good guy. The leafcutter bee is also a good guy. I mean, they're good pollinators and so forth, too. All bees are pollinators. It's just that the mason bee is a better pollinator than most of them. The leafcutter bee goes out and finds mostly smooth leaves and, for example, roses, and they just cut a nice little circle out, and then they use those little leaf bits to make their cocoons. So it almost look like little cigars inside, and there's a whole series of them in there. We're going to be actually doing a little bit more with leafcutter bees in the future. We're kind of in a developmental stage of figuring out how we're going to use those more. A wool carder bee can also use the hole. What they do is they go out and they take off the fuzz off of some of the various plants that are out there. I'm trying to think of the name of the plant, Susan. I'm going blank.
Lamb's ears.
Lamb's ear. Thank you. I went totally blank right there. Anyhow, lamb's ear is one of the types of plants that they get their little fuzz off of, and they put that in to help do in their nest before they put their eggs in. So anyhow, put their cells in. So these are just some things that you can find. There's other bees that'll end up in there too. Like we said, the Stelis montana, will come in and be an opportunist and use things too. So, but these are just some of the things you might find. But the reason you find these is because you left your block out after June 1st. So we want to keep saying June 1st, June 1st. So what's inside the bob hole, the blue orchard bee hole? First, you're going to find some mud walls, and then you're going to find cocoons. There's also frass. Frass is just a polite way of saying poop. So as Susan often says, if you drop something on your toe at a party, you can say, oh, frass, and most people won't know that you're saying something. There's also almost always mites in this, and then you may find some of the other things we've seen. There are about 5 to 8 cocoons in each hole or each tube. I have seen 9 or 10. I have seen as little as 3 or 4 in a tube. We're going to demonstrate how you can tell whether your tube is full or not. We'll do that in a later live demonstration. The female eggs are at the back, and they're larger cocoons, and then the males are nearer the opening, which we have talked about before. Each female lays about 24 eggs. You may see some female mason bees around after June 1st, still flying around, and think, oh gosh, I still have bees. I should have my my tubes out and stuff. Most likely, if they're still around, they're on their last days. They've probably laid all of their eggs. They're still pollinating, but we're not going to be helping them by leaving anything out later. When we harvest from a liner, we're going to unroll it like a tube of refrigerator biscuits. You're going to just...
I'm scandalized. I'm a Southern girl. I don't use refrigerator biscuits.
Well, the majority of us, no, the Northerners do. So anyhow, we unroll it, and then you can see that there's a mud wall there. You can see a cocoon. You can see some of the frass. I don't see mites in that particular picture. Pre-splitting makes it easier. You don't have to do all of that unrolling. You just take the edges of that apart and then be able to get your cocoons out more easily. You do have to replace that cardboard tube, as I said before, about every 3, 4, 5 years. And then the liners need to be replaced every year. Obviously, if you haven't pre-split them, you're going to destroy those liners anyhow, getting your cocoons out. But even the pre-split ones, you will too. And then be sure to look at those fairly carefully to be sure that they haven't even started to be used, because those tubes, those liners will not be used again if they have had that scent in there. Harvesting from a block. We have this picture kind of on purpose. We've seen this happen at some of the harvesting classes. One time somebody had it even at a more of an angle than this, and she was pushing, trying to get those cocoons out, and she said, oh my goodness, there's this stuff popping in here. She was literally popping each cocoon, and the bees were being destroyed. So you want to put that tool that you're using to push things out low and underneath the cocoons. Put it level with, parallel to the block, so that you are going under. The end of that particular piece of wood is cut at an angle so that it can go underneath that. So if you have a piece of dowel at home and can cut it at an angle, you can do that. We make some little tools that we sell, but just a dowel with it cut at an angle will work. We don't recommend things like pencils and things like that, because that would go puncture right into the cocoon. You want to go gently under the cocoons to lift them out. You don't need to be in a hurry. You can just gently push them out and try to protect them. Some important harvesting tips. Susan mentioned this before. When you're opening a tube or opening up a block, take out one row at a time. That way you can inspect very closely, make sure that there isn't chalk brood in there. You can probably even dump out a little bit of the mites off to the side and then start harvesting. You want to gently take off the mud wall. You can take the mites off of the cocoon, and also just gently with your fingers rub off some of the frass. We don't want to squeeze them, but you can manipulate them lightly and not cause any major problems.
They're very hardy in there.
They're very hardy in there. And you set those cocoons that you have kind of lightly cleaned off to the side, and then put the frass and the mites and the mud off to another side on your tray. And then you'll wash those cocoons later. And we're going to demonstrate that in a little bit. If you find a dead larva, you'll probably need to do some extra cleaning, because that means that there's chalk brood. The main purpose of doing the bleach wash is to get rid of that chalk brood. I got an email yesterday from someone who had a lot of chalk brood in one of our cocoon harvesting classes last year. And she did a really good job of doing the bleach wash, making sure that she was taking care of all of those cocoons and really timing the bleach wash and doing the proper so forth. And she reported that this year she had no chalk brood. So that was a win. Bleach washing really does get rid of the chalk brood. So we'll go now into the harvesting section, and we're going to take a little break here and set up to do that.
Okay, I told you earlier that I would demonstrate some things with teasel. This is a piece of teasel that you can see has a natural node, so you're cutting it off at that node. This is all sealed off at the end so that the bee can go into this side. You're going to look for the teasel that has the 3/4 inch size to it, and also look for segments that are about 6 inches long. Again, here is that node. In order to harvest from these, and once you've got cocoons in it, you're going to put a knife into the end of it, and then you're just going to twist. And by twisting, this will come apart very easily, and your cocoons will be laying in there. And you can see this segment here. This is very short, so I used this piece because it was short. It's only about 4 inches long, so it's not quite long enough. You just have a lot of males in this one. But it gives you an idea of how teasel works. There are kind of stickery things on here, and you can just take a glove and rub those off. You don't want to do it with your hands. You'll get little stickers on them when you're harvesting that. But I wanted to show you how to open teasel. We do have blocks that we harvest from. You'll notice that there's a black line here. The reason, or the blue line here, the reason we put that there was to be able to more easily put this back together again. So it's not anything terribly important to the bees, but it helps us put things back together again. What we're going to do is take these blocks apart. You can see that there are holes here. There are probably 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 that we can see, maybe 14 or 15 that are filled, 15, 16. Sorry about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo these screws to take this apart. I've undone that one already. This is a little Allen wrench that we're using to take apart our block. And you're going to see that there are lots and lots of cocoons in here. As I take this apart, you can see in this channel there are lots of mites. These mites have been here. These are the larger cocoons, so this was the back of this. These are the smaller cocoons, so this is the front of this one. I'm going to do one channel at a time. Going to very carefully, gently go underneath that. Again, keeping this level, not like this or I'll pop the cocoon. Keeping this level, I'm going to go underneath this and go underneath it and push these cocoons out. I'm not going to worry about those at that end. There's no reason why you can't turn it around and go in from the other direction as well and get the cocoons out. So I'm going to dump these cocoons onto the tray. As I said, we're doing one at a time. I'm not worrying about those mites. I'm going to put those aside. You can gently rub this cocoon to get off the frass and quite a few of the mites, and then put it off to the side. This is a larger cocoon compared to the smaller cocoons that I found. So this would be a female cocoon and that would be a male. Sometimes they're close enough together in size that we really can't tell the difference, but in general, the larger cocoon is the female. I do not see any chalk brood, but I do see the evidence of a bee that ended up either dying in there or coming in later and just dying within the cocoon. And that's not terribly unusual to find. So let's harvest another row. And this one has cocoons at the back as well. I so far have not seen any chalk brood, but I did find that bee that had died in there. If she comes in at the end of the year, or this could be another species of bee, and she has just run out of energy, she will die within the cell. We don't see those real often, but we do see them occasionally. And this is just removing all of the frass and the extra stuff. I'm doing it gently. I'm not squeezing it hard. I'm just doing the outside. The cocoon is pretty tough. I'm putting aside, there's a little tiny one, which is a male. I'm just putting aside the frass, the pollen mites, and putting everything over here. If you find a yellow part that's kind of sticky and clay-like, and this one's a little bit clay-like, it might be the remains of a pollen ball. I'm going to open up another section, maybe. Yes, this does have a lot of pollen mites. Okay, I would say that right here we're seeing chalk brood. There's a very curled, dead larva. So this channel I will not even go into because I don't want to disturb that. I'm trying to see what this is in this channel. I think that's again another dead bee. So this may have been left out a little bit later. This is, I'm pretty sure, a mason bee because of the iridescent stuff. So it's a female bee that just died in the cell. So this channel I'm not harvesting at all. I'm not disturbing it. I'm just going to harvest these other cells. If I were doing this at home and I found this chalk brood at this end, I would probably go ahead and harvest the ones at this end, but the one next to it I would not harvest. I would just sacrifice that. And again, I'm not harvesting that on purpose. I don't see any need to harvest that. I don't see any pollen balls in here this time like I sometimes do. There are not a lot of pollen balls left because obviously the bees use the pollen. But if you do find a pollen ball, it is kind of yellow also, like the mite. But when you go to touch it, it doesn't fall apart. It's more like clay-like. I've actually tasted it. It tastes kind of sometimes lemony, sometimes a little bit like a honey molasses flavor. Depends on what flowers they got the pollen from. So that's an example of how to clean the things. And then we're going to wash these in a little bit. You can see the bigger ones. Definitely some nice fat females for sure. We don't separate them. We wash them and put them all together. I know some places separate them, and there's really no reason to do that. We take this group. There's plenty of males there to pollinate those, or to fertilize those females, and so we just put a batch out together. We'll put out about 25 at a time. So that's probably about 25. I'm not even sure. Just out of curiosity, we'll find out how many we have. 10, 15, 20, 26. So we have 26 cocoons there. That doesn't take much space, and that's enough for one batch to put out. You can put out more than 25 at a time. You can put out 50 at a time if you want to. The other thing I wanted to show you was that often you have some tubes that have what appears to be 3 full ones and one that isn't full. If you take a dowel, this is a 1/4 inch dowel, and I've measured off 6 inches so that we know that this is a 6-inch tube. If you put your dowel into the empty spot, what appears to be empty, you will see that it doesn't go in 6 inches. So you know now that this section back here has cocoons in it. Another thing I promised to demonstrate for you was, again, a little closer view of it, how to split liners. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your letter opener, and you're going to just literally come down the edge of this and split it. When you're ready to harvest, instead of having to unfurl this, you're going to be able to just tease that apart and find your cocoons inside. It makes it much faster than having to uncurl this whole thing.
Okay, these are cardboard tubes with liners. And I'm going to show how to harvest from these. The first problem is to get the liner out of the cardboard tube. It's nice to have something like a needle nose, pliers, or tweezers. You can punch out the mud plug at the end, because Mom always leaves about more than 1/2 inch of space, so I'm not going to have to worry about stabbing a baby bee. Okay, so that starts come out easily, and this happily is a split liner, so I can just there goes a mud plug. And you can see that I have cocoons in there and a chalk brood. Okay, those are toast. There is chalk brood in here. All right, let's see what's in the next one. Okay, I can put that tube aside and use it, but again, mud plug in the end. Couple of cocoons, a lot of pollen mites. The orange is that is a pollen ball that didn't get eaten, and the reason it's orange is that was the color of the pollen that was being harvested. Yeah, there's a lot of pollen mites in there too. And one more cocoon. You never know what you're going to find in these things. It's kind of like a box of assorted chocolates. All right. And you just clean them up the same way.
So one of the things that you do when you're harvesting the cocoons, you may not have time to wash them that day. Maybe you have a party coming, you've gotten partway through. If you don't have time to wash them right away, put them in a paper bag, closed paper bag, and just put them in your refrigerator to keep them cool until you have time to wash them. Ideally, you would wash them within a couple of days. If you don't harvest and wash your cocoons on time, you can have more problems. So we want to be sure that you do wash them fairly soon after you harvest them. When we clean cocoons, we're going to use a bleach wash. As we said, the bleach wash kills the chalk brood, but it also helps take off some of the mites that we find, and it'll help just being in the water. It'll take off some of the mud and some of the frass and so forth. We're going to use either a brand name like Clorox, which has 8% bleach, or if you use a non-brand name, which is usually a 4% bleach, then you will double the amount of bleach that we're recommending. So you're going to wash and clean the cocoons. You're going to use 2 ounces or about 4 tablespoons of bleach per gallon. And you're going to put those cocoons in water and leave them there for 2 minutes. We use a timer so that we don't forget. These cocoons are made of silk. So because they're made of silk, they dissolve very easily. If you've ever splashed bleach on or gotten bleach on a silk blouse, you know that you've destroyed it. It's very, very important that when you're washing the cocoons and have done the 2 minutes in the bleach, that you rinse them in cold water. We don't want to rinse them in hot water or warm water because you can, at that point, make the cocoons think that it's warm enough to come out. So we don't want to make them hatch at this point, but wash them in cold water and then gently rinse them at least a couple of times, making sure that you can get some of the frass off, some of the mites off and things like that. We want to be sure that we get them pretty clean so that they won't have issues the following year. After you've done the washing, you want to put the cocoons out on a paper towel. I usually put them out on a paper towel and let them dry a tiny bit and then put them on a drier paper towel and then let them sit out for about an hour until they're dry to the touch before we put them in the refrigerator. We want to have them at room temperature. We want them to have, or you can put them in the refrigerator to dry as well. You don't want to use a hair dryer to dry them. First of all, you'll have cocoons all over the room. And second, heat does equal hatched cocoons. So let them dry for about an hour. And then the next step that we're going to do is we're going to store them. Their cocoons are stored in our refrigerator from October until March, or November until March, depending on when you were harvesting. The reason we're storing them in the refrigerator is we're giving them a humidity level that's about the same as what they would have in nature. It also gives them a constant temperature, so it helps more of the cocoons survive, besides our cleaning and washing. So you're going to use a small container, and you're going to add a little cup to that, a second container with a paper towel in it, and you're going to make that paper towel damp. And that will raise the humidity in that container. You'll want to puncture holes in the top of the container or leave the lid slightly ajar. And you're going to put this in your refrigerator bin, which has the highest humidity in the refrigerator. Obviously, we have refrigerators that are frost-free, so they take a lot of humidity out. So that refrigerator veggie bin is the part that has the most. And then we're adding a little extra moisture by having our second little container with a damp towel. Check that paper towel fairly regularly and make sure that it stays damp so that you can make sure that those cocoons have the right humidity in there.
But that is not in contact with the cocoons.
And
they are
not
on a
in
dry paper towel.
Right. The paper towel that's on the bottom is a dry paper towel and the cocoons are on top. The picture I'm showing you right here has about 160 cocoons. So they're very small. They're kind of like a coffee bean size. So they're not going to take up much space. That picture kind of exaggerates the size of the container that I have there. And so you don't need a huge container in your refrigerator bin. You don't have to take up a lot of space. Obviously, if you have 5, 6, 7,000 cocoons, you will need a little more space. But most of us will have 100 to 300 cocoons, or maybe even 25 to 50. Make sure you have those air holes. Check it periodically, probably every couple of weeks or at least once a month, to be sure that there's no mold. The mold, if you do find any mold, you can take those cocoons out and you can do a very quick bleach wash again, shorter period of time because you don't want to destroy too much silk, but that will help get some of the mold off, and then you can dry them again and put them back in the refrigerator. So I think that's pretty much what you need to do as far as that. Don't freak out. Very few times do you actually have these cocoons hatch in the refrigerator. I will tell a story about myself. Susan always loves this story. About 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when I was first doing this, I had, it was a nice winter day, and I made a big amount of soup. And when I got done with the soup, I put it in the refrigerator like I usually do. And I didn't really pay attention to what the temperature of the soup was. Next day, I checked on my cocoons, and I found 2 or 3 very slow moving. They're not moving very fast because it's cold in there, but 2 or 3 hatched cocoons. And there were a couple of bees moving around, crawling around very slowly. And I could not figure out what the heck I had done. Some of you have probably already figured it out now. I put that hot soup above my veggie bin, and I made that veggie bin hot enough that the bees decided it was time to come out. So make sure you cool your soup before you put it in the refrigerator. You can put it in thin pans. The home economist was talking to me about that, as well as somebody that worked at a restaurant. Put it in some thin pans, let it cool a little bit, and then put it back in your pot. Obviously, if you're getting your refrigerator that hot, you're also heating up your mayonnaise and all the other things, milk and stuff in the refrigerator. So bad mistake on my part, but it's a learning experience and something that you want to pay attention to.
Okay, I am going to demonstrate how we do the bleach wash. We are using Clorox, so we are going to use the full strength amount. This bowl will hold approximately a quart of water, so I'm going to add the quart of water to it. And then I'm going to add a tablespoon, because a tablespoon per quart versus 4 tablespoons per gallon. So a tablespoon of bleach. If you're a little bit over, that's okay. It's better to be a little over than a little under. I'm going to mix that together. And then I'm going to put my cocoons into the water. There is some mites. There are some frass on this. You can gently, very gently, get some of that frass off.
Could you do that part?
Yes.
My head. From you can very gently.
You can very gently move these around and slightly wipe off, and we're talking very gently, wipe off some of the dirt and some of the frass that's on here. We are timing this. It needs to be exactly or very close to 2 minutes. So I am watching this to do it. As you can see, the water is turning yellow. That is from the mites. And then there is a lot of mud and frass in the bottom of the bowl. So we're just going to let it sit here for 2 minutes and let the silk slightly dissolve. On the outside of each of these silk things, the silk is a little bit fuzzy, so this will dissolve some of the fuzz off of that, which will also make it harder for the mites to hide in there. There will still be a few mites left, possibly, so we want to be sure that we're taking care of that. But the main purpose of the bleach, not only besides washing this, is to get rid of the chalk brood. If there is chalk brood that you've missed, it's easy to miss a chalk brood if you don't see it. So just sitting there for 2 minutes. This is going to get cut short so that it's not exactly 2 minutes, but just to give you the idea. Use a timer, do the 2 minutes. Very gently moving them around helps get off a little extra. And then you can just let them sit there and periodically stir them. You might be able to tell even at this point that they're a little shinier than they were before because some of that silk has been dissolved already. All right, the 2 minutes is almost up. we've gone away and we are not, we're coming back now. We're going to pour those cocoons into a strainer. I'm going to wash away this excess mud and mites and so forth from our original bowl. We want to be sure that we get the bleach off of the cocoons. You can see there's still mud in the bottom of this, so I'm going to be rinsing gently. I don't want to put a heavy stream on this, but I do want to get all the bleach off of here because I want to have just the cocoons left. We're going to, I can do it a little harder than that, but we're going to gently rinse these. We want to rinse them more than once. I'm actually going to, because this strainer is, as you can see, the mud's going down through here. We're also probably getting some mites off. If you gently go back and forth, you'll get some more mites off. But you want to rinse it for a while. Rinse it for a couple of times so that you are sure that you've got all that bleach off so it doesn't continue bleaching and destroying the silk. This is not a heavy stream because I don't want to cause damage to the bees, but I do want to get all of that bleach off. And then the next step is to put these cocoons on a tray or on your counter with a dry paper towel. I'm going to try to get a little bit of the water off of that before I pour it out. I'm going to pour it out, dump it on the tray, and then spread them out. It's very wet where I just did that, so you might replace that, replace this for a second time, or you may just spread them out to drier areas. And you're going to let them sit for about an hour. They will dry out, and then you will put them in your refrigerator.
We have now got dried cocoons. They're not desiccated dry, but they have essentially dried off. I'm now going to put them into the container I've prepared to put into the refrigerator. This is the smaller container that has a damp paper towel in it. The other paper towel is dry. So I'm going to set the smaller container down in there, and I'm going to put my cocoons onto the dry paper towel. And now I have a lid that has holes punched in it. They don't need much oxygen, but they do need some. And now this will go into the vegetable bin of my refrigerator. For the first 6 weeks, I'll check it at least once a week to see if mold is forming. If it is forming, I will then do another very quick bleach wash, dry, and then I will clean my storage container with a sanitary wipe or a bleach wipe, and I will put fresh paper towels in there and put my cocoons back. If after about 6 weeks I haven't seen any sign of mold, my experience is it's not likely to happen. So I'll maybe drop back to checking every 3 or 4 weeks after that until March, when it's time to begin thinking about putting them out. And they should be healthy and look exactly like they do now.
When you're all done, you'll have your blocks and your tools that you use to clean that have come in contact possibly with chalk brood. So you're going to want to be able to wash those also with a bleach wash. You will can use a nice little spongy thing that you can buy at the store, which does a good job of kind of scraping off some of the mites. Also getting rid of, just disinfecting everything. You don't want to put your blocks in and soak them for a long period of time because you will cause warping then. And as soon as you're done cleaning your blocks, you're going to want to clamp them back together again so that they don't warp and so that they last for a long period of time. We have added a new step that we hadn't recommended in the past, and that is before you put your blocks back together, and this is for using the wooden blocks and for the wooden tools, you're going to use a hairdryer that's on high, a hot heat, and you're going to go over the surfaces for a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. What this is doing is it's probably blowing off a lot of the residual mites, but it's also drying out a lot of those and killing them. So we're finding that the mites, even after just washing them gently, sometimes survive on those blocks, even though we've been scrubbing on them and so forth. So we found that heating this with a hair dryer is a good way to dry them out. And then you want to be sure to clamp those blocks back together.
I am going to demonstrate how you wash your blocks and also your wooden tools. This is really important because this helps get rid of the mites, and it also gets rid of any residual chalk brood that might be on the things. The measurement on this is not as important because this is going to stay on the blocks for quite a bit of time. So putting in bleach in this one, is the measurement part is not quite as critical because we're not dissolving anything. We don't want to have this sitting in the water for long periods of time. So what I'm doing, I like this particular thing because it does a good job of scrubbing, is I scrub the spots, gets the bleach on it, and I scrub the whole thing, even the areas that haven't had stuff in it, because that chalk brood is a fungus. It does not have to be perfectly clean. There will be stains from the mud walls or from the mites, and that's okay. But we're going to just do that. We're going to rinse it off a little bit. We're going to do the backside on this particular type too. And then we're going to set it aside. I will let it dry for just a short period of time, and then I'm going to put the whole block back together again so that it won't warp. I also want to be sure to wash this tool too because it came in contact with potential chalk brood and of course with mites, so I'm going to try to get as much off as possible. Like I said, it doesn't have to be an extreme wash, but we want to get off some of the stuff and also get that bleach exposure. One of the last things that you're going to do now, because there are mites probably still living on there, is to take a hair dryer, put it on the highest heat, and dry this. Okay. So what we have done here is we have dried the surface some, which is good for preventing warping. We have made sure that we have dried out some of the residual mites that might still be there. If you have a loop, you might want to look at it and see if you can see any mites. If you do, you can go ahead and spray again, but most likely that will get rid of most of the mites. We found that we didn't always get rid of all the mites just by doing the bleach wash. So there would still be a few residual mites. So this is just another step to help prevent the mites from being a problem the next year. You can do the same thing with this tool, dry it as well. And I think that's the most important thing, and just to finish off properly, to clean your blocks and clean your wooden tools. If you have chalk brood, and a lot of chalk brood, you might actually want to take some bleach and water, put it in a spray bottle, and just spray your actual house to be sure that those spores aren't out there as well.
This is a review of the things you need to do throughout the year for your bees. I think probably the most important thing you can do is sign up for our BeeNotes. That is an email service that we do to remind you of what needs to be done when, and also provide new research information as it comes along. And don't worry, we are way too lazy to spam you all the time. So you probably wouldn't hear from us more than 6 or 8 times a year. Okay. In mid-March, you watch the temperature and you watch the weather forecast, and you want 3 days in a row where the temperature is above 50 and without heavy rain forecast. Light rain is fine, but not torrential, drenching rain. So when you get to that, and it may be after the 1st of April before that happens, but you put out a half to a third of your cocoons, but a minimum of 25. And we have an emergence tube that we can provide to you, or you can make your own. That's just a piece of PVC pipe with caps on each end, and on one end there is a 5/16 to a 1/2 inch hole drilled. You don't want it bigger than that because other bees will go in there, or other pests, and you don't want it smaller than that because your big fat mama bees can't get out. So anyway, that's the size. The little
Cardboard box with a hole would work too, a small cardboard box.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be PVC pipe, but any kind of container that is dark inside so they can look up and see that hole that is light. And that's where they'll go to when they hatch out. And then after a couple of weeks, you put out another portion of bees, depending on cocoons, depending on how many you have, and they should all be out by April the 15th. The reason that we're doing this in stages is that if there's a bad weather event, you've hedged your bets, because who knows what the weather's going to do around here in the spring. So you can put them out all at once if you just have to, but it gives them a little bit better chance if you put them out in stages. You also need to make sure before you start putting them out if there's something in bloom out there for them to eat. They need something in bloom. It might not be something you think of as having a bloom, like maple. A lot of people don't realize that those are blooming plants. They are wind pollinated, so their flowers are not very showy, but they do make a lot of pollen because they don't know where it's going to go. They have to make enough of it to raise the chances of the pollen reaching a female part of the plant. So they make just buckets of pollen, and the mason bees steal it. They're not doing the plant any good at all, unlike when they pollinate a fruit tree. But it's plenty of pollen for them to eat. Willows are the same way. Again, wind pollinated, but they make a lot of pollen. So make sure there's something out there that they can eat. And okay.
One of the things I want to say here is you're going to determine when you put your cocoons out. We get calls or emails all the time. Is it time to put out my cocoons yet? A couple of years ago in February, we had 50 to 54, we had 60-degree temperatures for about a week and a half. And I was getting phone calls or an email saying, can I put my cocoons out now? Well, there wasn't anything blooming out there, and we had a cold weather event 2 weeks later. So no, that's too early. So we are watching the temperature, you're watching what's blooming. We can't see what's in your yard. Your yard might not have fruit trees, or it may not have a big leaf maple, but you may have a huge amount of other plants that are blooming, that are providing pollen, that are more ornamental. So we can't come to each yard and say, okay, it's time to put out your cocoons. You're going to have to look at your yard and be sure you have something blooming, and also something blooming after that. If your apple tree is blooming, your second, and it ends and you don't have anything else blooming, don't put out your second batch until you have something else blooming. You want to be sure that you're providing pollen for those bees.
The mason bees will only travel about 100, maybe 300 yards, not yards, feet, about a football field.
Yards, it's like football field.
Yeah. So if you don't have anything in the immediate area, they're out of luck. And you do want to keep them there in your yard, so give them something to eat.
Honeybees travel mile to even up to 5 miles, but these mason bees are very localized, so they don't go very far. They are very important pollinators, though. And one of the other questions I get from BeeNotes fairly often is that I put my cocoons out, but nothing's happening. I haven't seen anything hatch. So about 2 to 5 days after you put the cocoons out, you will start seeing some hatching. They're waiting for the right temperature. They need to get warmed up again, and they're just kind of waiting to be sure that they're ready to hatch. So it will take 2 to 5 days for them to start hatching. The males will come out first. They will have those little white whiskers, so you'll see them flying around first, and they'll fly around for a while, and then the females will start hatching. The females are coming out, and they need to have their reproductive system finished developing. So they'll fly around for 2 or 3 days as well. They'll also be flying around the block, looking, or the tubes, kind of looking at it and deciding, is this a good hole for me? Do I want to use this hole to start laying my eggs? So you're not going to get the holes filled immediately either. So the bees will be out for a little while before you actually see any evidence. It could be a couple of weeks till you see a whole tube starting to be filled. So don't panic. They're out there, they're working, they're collecting pollen, they're getting ready to do their job. We cannot say this often enough. June 1st, you're going to avoid that parasitic wasp if you take your blocks and tubes inside. Put them in a paper bag instead of a box, because a box has more holes to it where they could, where other things can get in. But fold over the top, staple it or clip it shut, and then put it in a warm place like your garage or a shed from this time until, from June 1st until October, November, when you're getting ready to harvest. We do ask that you put your blocks or tubes in an upright position. For example, you're going to put it in like this direction versus that direction in your bag. The reason we're saying that, and something that came up in one of our BeeNotes and got us to thinking about it, the same with the block, you're going to want to have the holes where the plugs are, you're going to put those upright as well. If for some reason you've dropped the tubes while you were putting things away, or the block, or you bumped it somehow, you could possibly, with some of those later laid eggs, have knocked either the larva or the egg off of that pollen ball. So it's more likely, if it's in an upright position, that the pollen ball will, the egg or the larva will still be laying on top of any pollen ball that might be left. It's not an absolute, but it's just something that we think can help a little bit. So June 1st is when we take in the blocks and the tubes. We store them in the garage until October or November. We do our harvesting. The harvesting can start usually in mid-October. It can go through early to mid-November. If you forget to do your harvesting and it's December, even it's close to Christmas, still harvest your cocoons. What we're doing by harvesting these cocoons and putting them in the cool refrigerator is we're making them be a healthier cocoon. We're giving them as much of their energy as they can possibly have. The longer you wait to harvest your cocoons, the more energy they're going to use, and so they're less likely to survive. We want to have nice, healthy bees coming out back in March. Susan mentioned the BeeNotes. I'm very involved with that. Richard Little, who is a retired entomologist and a Linn Master Gardener, does a lot of the writing for this. I do some of the writing for this. We also publish things that we find along the way, maybe some new pests that are coming that have been seen in the area or things like that. If you'll sign up for BeeNotes, you can do that at linnmastergardeners.com. We'll have other information there now as well. At the moment, we have an issue with our website, so some of the things that we had on it in the past have disappeared. We're going to be putting those back on, so keep watching for it. You will find the Mason bee calendar, which will give you some good hints about when to do what. You'll have some house place instructions. Those have disappeared at the moment, so just check periodically at linnmastergardeners.com and you can find a lot of information. We do have old BeeNotes, archived BeeNotes from the past year also on that website. So if you missed something or you think you've missed something, you can go back and look. We also will post on there how you can find bee supplies and houses and blocks and tubes. We do sell them and we'll have them available at the Linn Extension office. We'll probably have some pickup dates and things. We're figuring out how we're going to do that this year. And then cocoons are not available until March. We're having them in storage until March. We want to give people healthy cocoons, so we're keeping them in good storage until March. We will tell you when they're available, how to get them. Some of the local nurseries will have some of our cocoons as well. We tend to sell our supplies at a little less cost than the nurseries, but the nurseries certainly have some of those supplies too. Sign up for BeeNotes. If you have suggestions or questions, you can email me. My email address is on there. Rich Little's email address is also on there. If I don't know the answer, I often CC Rich Little and he answers the question because he has a much broader knowledge than I do. I've learned most of what I know from him, as well as reading a lot of the articles that we have had available. Future BeeNotes should be coming pretty soon. There are some occasional pests to the blue orchards, blister beetles we found last year. I think was the first time that I was aware of them. They were probably there before and I didn't recognize what they were. But if you can look closely at the very bottom cocoon, you can see a little bit of a red in there. The blister beetles are red, and they can also use these cells. So Houdini fly and its larva can also be in the in your channels. So these are some things that are not as common pests. They're an occasional pest, but we will be giving you more information about those. We want to try to tell you about all the pests that we're aware of so that you can recognize what they are as we go along. Just some other information about pollinators in general. Birds also do a little bit of pollinating. They like scarlet, orange, red, and white flowers. Flies like brown and purple flowers. Butterflies like the reds and pink flowers, purple flowers the best. Beetles like dull white and green flowers, and bees, of course, as we said earlier, like white, yellow, blue, purple flowers. And then again, our website, I'm going to leave this up for just a little bit. Note that our guidelines that we've given you today are tailored for the Willamette Valley. We want our cocoons to stay within this region that is within the east and west boundaries of the Coast Range down to the Cascades, and the northern boundaries from Portland to the southern boundary of the Umpqua area. We would prefer that our species of bees doesn't interbreed with other species of mason bees. There are a lot of other mason bees besides the blue orchard bee. The blue orchard bee has been studied a lot more, so you will know more information about this particular bee than some of the other mason bees. Or even some of the other pollinating bees. Kind of hard to study some of the ground bees, and about 70% of bees are ground nesting bees. You can check with your local county extension or maybe with your Department of Agriculture or Xerces Society if you are outside of our range. and get some information about the local mason bee there and how you can help at that location.